Hi everyone and welcome to today's Figma tutorial. So have you ever wondered how you can create a filterable image gallery using Figma? As you can see, every time I search and switch, I can actually filter all the images into the category as I actually want them. So how do we do this in Figma? Find out in today's video. Alright, so I have this new project here and I'm going to call it Filterable Image Gallery. Alright, so there we go. So next we're going to insert a frame. So the frame shall be, let's go with something of the desktop size. So let's go with MacBook Pro 14. So that would do. Alright, so next let's give this some margins. Let's add a layout grid. Let's change this to columns. Then we're going to give this a margin of 70. Right, and I believe that looks fine. Alright, so we're going to be using this. So let's type in some text. Alright, so zoom in, type in the text photo gallery. Then we're actually going to make this bold. So all the text is in form of inter, and then we're going to make this bold. Make sure everything is selected. Then let's give this a font size of 30. And let's just make sure it actually touches this margin. Something. So let's go to the plugins iconify. Then search for, type in search. Then we're going to select a search icon. Let's select this one, paste it in. Then let's also search for menu. So drag this and drop it in. So there we go. So we have our menu and the search selected. So drag these out of their frames, delete those frames. Right, then drag these onto your frame, main frame here. And there we go. So just going to scale these up a little bit. Right, that looks better. Alright, so next I'm going to insert in some boxes. So I'm going to make use of the rectangle tool, give it dimensions. I'm going to go with 229 by 229. I believe that will fit perfectly. Then I'm actually going to duplicate this multiple times. So hold Alt, then place the next one just right next to it. Hold Alt again, and Alt again. Let's actually make sure they're actually next to each other. Then we're going to duplicate this one more time. So let's give these different colors. Alright, so now that we have that, we can actually duplicate this. So hold Alt, duplicate that, and then hold Alt one more time. So we now have 18 boxes. So now select all of them and we're going to actually create an auto layout. Right click and then select the option add auto layout. And then we're actually going to set it to wrap auto layout, and then we're going to make sure the gap between them is actually set to 0, so everything is actually basically together. Right, so there we go. So that's how I actually want it. Then lastly, we can actually now disable this. Right, so there we go. So we actually have our boxes here. So next we're going to go to our Unsplash plugin. So select Unsplash plugin, and then we're going to insert images to all the boxes. And then inside the frame, randomly select any box that you want and actually fill it up with the image by actually just clicking until every box is filled. Alright, so once you've filled it with random images, now I've selected images that actually have an ocean, women, men, and then I've chosen those that have bicycles and birds. So that's the category that I've actually chosen. So when you actually fill up every box, now you can actually rename them. So now just make sure that all those boxes that actually have the oceans depicted actually have the same name. So where there is ocean here, I'm actually going to call this ocean. Then I'll go to the next one. Then this shall also be called ocean. Then select this. So just make sure that all the categories that you actually want to filter together have the same name. Now do that for each individual image. So this shall actually represent, so there will be one for women, birds, that for men, and bicycle. So let's do that quickly. Alright, so now we've done renaming each one of them. So there is a group that is called ocean. There is that for woman, bird, man, and bicycle. So this will actually enable us make the filtering process easy. So lastly, we're going to rename this frame that they're actually all grouped in. We're going to call this images. Alright, so next I'm going to create the menus. So now let's zoom in. Then we're going to make use of this rectangle tool. So we're going to draw something like that. And then we're actually going to give it dimensions 108 by 43. So there we go. Then we're going to give it a border radius of 20. Then we're actually going to give it a color for the form when it is still deselected. So we're going to give this a color with coordinates E8, E8, E8. Right, so there we go. Then we're going to type some text in. Then this text is going to be all photos. Then we're actually going to scale this text down. We're going to give it a font size of 12.8. Let's actually leave it bolded and inter, so that's actually okay. So let's place this at the top. So actually going to center this, make sure it's centered. So there we go. Alright, so next I'm going to duplicate this box, then hold Alt. Then now we have a second copy. So in the second copy, turn this text to white. Then we're going to turn this rectangle to black. So now we actually have a deselected state and then a selected state. Alright, so now what we want is that when a user clicks on the button, this is the state that will actually appear. So this will be the selected state and this will be the deselected state. So now we're going to group this here. So group this, and then we're going to call this group selected. Then we're actually going to group this also, group this, then we're going to call this group deselected. Alright, so now we're going to do the same thing for all the other different categories. So actually we're going to duplicate these two. So let's duplicate this here. Let's do it in 5 different groups. Alright, so there we go. So these are the 5 different groups. So now next we're going to go back to this state here and we're actually going to group this. So place this selected state on top of the deselected. Make sure they actually align together. Alright, so next we're actually going to group these. So group this selection and we're going to call it all photos. Alright, so now that we've done that, we're actually going to go to the others. Then we're also going to rename them. So we're going to call this group oceans, and this shall also have to be oceans. Alright, so next make sure that text is actually aligned to the center. Make sure it's the same thing here. Then we're actually going to place this on top of that. So we have the selected on top of this unselected. Then we're actually going to group these. And this group is going to be called oceans selected. Alright, so next move to the next group. Then we're going to rename this. So we're going to have that for women. Then we're going to have that for men. They're going to have this for bicycle. Let's call it bicycles. And lastly, we're going to have this for birds. Alright, so next make sure here and here, make sure the text is aligned to center. Same thing here. Make sure this is also aligned to center. Align that to center. Same thing here. Alright, then make sure that we have this selected on top of that unselected. Align them together. Then we're going to call this group women selected. Then we're also going to do the same thing here. So make sure that this is on top of that. Make sure they actually align together. And call this group men selected. Then we're going to also do the same thing here. Group these. Place this on top of that. Align them. Give this a group name. Call it bicycles selected. And lastly, place this on top of that. Group this birds selected. Right, now that we're done with that, we can actually bring this all into the frame. So actually let's rename this. Instead of all photos, it's all photos selected. Right, so now we actually want to align them in a straight line. So select all these buttons, so the menu buttons, then we're actually going to give them an auto layout. So they're actually all in a frame. Then make sure they're actually laid out horizontally. Then we're going to space them by, give them a space of 30. There we go. Then drag them all down. Alright, so now we have all of them laid out horizontally. Then actually make sure that they actually scale them. Make sure they're actually at the center of the frame. There we go. Alright, so the next step shall be to rename this menu that actually contains this menu. We're going to rename that frame to be menu. Let's just call it the menu. Alright, so now there we go. So we actually now have a frame that controls the images, and we actually have a frame that has the menu. So actually right now we have a frame that actually contains the items, the images, and then we also have that frame that contains the items in the menu. So now next we're going to create some variables. So we're going to create variables that actually have the boolean type. So the first variable is one that's going to help us that control all the different menus. So let's have one to control the all selected menu. Let's call it all photos. Then we're going to duplicate this. We're going to have one for oceans selected. Make another one. Have one for women selected. And so on. Right, so now we actually have now a variable to actually represent each of the different individual items on the menu. So now we also need to have variables that actually control the images that are actually here on display. So let's create those variables. So we're going to have a variable, and they're also going to be in this term of boolean. So let's actually just duplicate this. So we're going to have one to represent the oceans images, and then let's make one for each kind of image. Alright, so now we actually now have an individual variable for each one. So next we're going to assign the different variables. Alright, so now we're actually going to assign the variables. So let's start with the menu. So inside the menu, we actually can see the different items that we actually have. So what we're going to do is we're going to go inside the menu, and then we're actually going to assign the variable to the selected part of it. So let's start with ocean. So make sure you have the selected group, and then we're actually going to go to where we have the pass through. Then we're going to right click on your mouse, and then we're going to assign the menu icon for ocean. So remember, we're dealing with the oceans menu first. So we're going to click ocean selected. So assign that. So that's ocean selected. So go to the group where we have women. So go to the selected group. Then we're going to also right click and assign women selected. Go to the men's group. Then we're also going to assign men selected, and so on. And then lastly, we're going to go to where we have the all photos selected. So select the selected group in the all photos, and then also going to assign the all photos selected. So as you can see, they've actually all gone off, and that is because our variables by default are actually set to false. So as you can see, actually the items are not arranged in the order that I actually want. So I'm actually going to rearrange them. So let's make sure that the all photos group is actually first on the list. Alright, so now to have it first, we actually want to make sure that all photos is actually selected by default. So actually go to where we actually have all the selected, and then we're actually going to change this variable and make sure it is set to true. So let's go back to the original. So inside local variables, make sure this one is actually set to true, and that will actually make sure that it is actually by default selected. And then every time we want to actually select another item, we should actually set it to off. So that's actually what we're going to be doing. Alright, so next we're actually now going to also assign the variables that actually go with the images. So remember that we actually have variables that actually now control the images. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to select all the images that actually have the ocean. So select each one, hold Ctrl on your keyboard to actually make sure you select each one. Then we're actually going to go to the pass through, and then we're going to assign to them the oceans variable. Then we're also going to do the same thing for the by scores. Make sure they're all selected. Then we're also going to assign, right click, and then select by scores. Let's go to bird. Make sure they're all selected. Assign to them the variable for birds. Then we're going to go to that of women. Then we're also going to assign the variable for women. Then lastly, we're going to assign the variable of men to those men. Now as you can see, all the images actually disappear by default or become with opacity 0. And why is that? It's because they initially have their variable set to false. So we're going to actually make sure that variables are by default set to true. So make sure this is set to true. And there we go. So when they're set to true, they'll actually appear by default. Alright, so the next step is first to do some prototyping. So let's go to the prototype mode. And then now we're actually going to, let's close this. Let's make sure we go to the menu. Now inside the menu, let's first deal with what happens when all photos is selected. So let's create an interaction there. Then we're going to make sure the interaction is on click, and we're going to add a condition. So inside the conditional, now we actually want to set some settings. So now the first important thing is we want to make sure that the variable all photos selected is actually set on. So you actually have to check for that condition. So now this is the variable here. So we want to make sure that it is actually set on. If this is equal to false, we actually want to make sure that it is actually turned on. So that's actually going to be the first important thing. So if it is actually set to false, we're going to make sure that it will actually be turned on and made true. So that's going to be the most important first variable. And then next after that, once that condition is satisfied, we want to make sure that in case any of these was actually turned on, that they're actually all set to false. That's also going to be very, very important. So I want to make sure that all those other variables are set to false in case they were actually true. So make sure this variable ocean selected is set to false if it was true. Let's also set another variable, women selected. Make sure that is set to false. That's once this is clicked on. Then let's also set another variable, men selected, set that to false. Then also going to set the variable for now I want to make sure that bird selected is also set to false. That's if it was actually true. Then lastly, I want to make sure that bicycle selected is also set to false. Let's actually search for bicycles selected. Make sure that is also set to false. Alright, so let's make sure that all these are under this if statement, so that immediately this is actually turned on. So immediately we set all photos selected to true, all these others are actually set to false by default. Alright, and then we also want to add some other statements also. So I want to also make sure that now in this case it definitely means that all these should actually be put on. So we're going to add variables also. So now we're going to have variables, one to represent the men. Let's have one. Let's actually first close this like that. Let's actually set these other variables. Close this. So let's make sure these other variables are set to true in this case. So the variables representing the images should all be set to true when it is on all photos. So that's oceans, that's women should also be set to true. Also going to set the variable for men to true, and so on. Alright, so we must make sure that all the variables that actually represent the images are set to true every time we have all photos selected. Alright, so now let's also drag these, let them also be under this if statement, so that in case all this happens, these are actually all set to true in that case. So now you may not be able to see what happens in this case until I actually set the next variable. So let's first work on the next variable. Let's close this. Let's go to where we have ocean selected. So what happens when oceans here is clicked on? So let's add an interaction. So it's also going to have a condition. So the condition statement shall be, we must actually first test that this, if this was false, it should actually be set on. So if ocean selected was actually false, let's say that if it was actually set to false initially, it means that now we're actually going to set the variable for ocean selected to true. So that's going to be very, very important. So this should actually be set to true if it was actually false initially. And then next, we're actually going to have to make sure that all these others are actually set off. So this, and that should actually all be off. So make sure that all the other selections are actually off when oceans is selected. So all photos selected should actually be set to false when we have ocean selected. Let's actually work on all those individual variables for selected. Sorry, so this is wrong. So let's add a variable actually. So this variable for women selected should actually be set to false, and so on. Alright, so we have to make sure that all the other selections apart from oceans are set to false in that case. So in this case, if this was true, oceans will be set to true and all these others will be set to false. Let's make sure they're all under that if statement. Alright, and then lastly, we want to make sure that also in the images, we want to make sure that only the photos that actually have oceans actually remain selected. So only ocean photos should actually remain true and all the other photos should actually be set to false. Let's also work on those variables. So we're going to set those variables for the images. So let's have variable for oceans shall be set to true. And then let's set the other variables of the images to let's set the other variables of the images to false. So women shall actually be set to false, and likewise to the other variables. Alright, so now we've actually set all the other variables, so all the other images are set to false except oceans that are actually left as true. So let's see what happens. But before we do that, let's actually make sure that all these are under the if statement. So let's drag them in. Right, so let's actually test what happens in this case. So let's preview that. So as you can see, when all photos is selected, this is what we have. So when I go to oceans, you can actually see that only the photos that actually have oceans remain selected. Now, as you can see, all the others are actually deselected. So all photos becomes deselected when you actually click on this. So this actually becomes false when you actually click on this. And then when you go back, you can actually see what happens. Now, all these others are not yet set on, so we're actually going to have to work on them also. But as you can see, it's actually working. Let's go to women selected, and then we're also going to add an interaction. Let's add a conditional. So we must first make sure to test that if women selected is actually false, it should actually be set to true. So that's going to be the first thing. So once that happens, we can actually set the variable for women to true. And then all the other variables for the selections on the menu should actually be set to false. Alright, so let's drag this in. Then lastly, now we also have to make sure that only the images that actually have women are actually set to true. So let's work on the variables for the images. So as you can see, all the other variables for images are set to false except that for women, which is actually set to true. So let's make sure that they're all under the if statement. Then let's test this. Right, so as you can see, when I select the women, you can actually see on the women's images actually set on, and that's actually what happened. So you can actually work on, so I'm going to quickly work on all the others while doing and following the same procedures. Alright, so lastly we've set that for the birds, and we finally set that to the right conditions. So let's actually test that. Now let's see that in the prototype preview. Then as you can see, when I click on oceans, when I click on women, when I click on men, by scores, and the birds, you can actually see all the changes. So now this is a very much working filterable image gallery, just as we actually wanted. So if you followed through this video, I hope the video really helped you understand all these things further. I know it's a little bit complex, but I believe that as you practice, you'll actually get better in understanding how to work with variables. I hope this video really helped you. If it did, feel free to give the video a thumbs up, and then if you're new to this channel, I encourage you to join the community by subscribing, and then make sure to hit the notification bell so that you get updated every single time I upload a new video. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all in the next video. Bye.